So in this video, we're going to be examining the anatomy of a typical long bone. So when we say long bone, we know from structural classification of bones that we have some that are long, meaning that they are longer than they are short. Some examples are the femur, radius, ulna, humerus, etc. And so let's take a look at what these long bones are really made up of, both on the inside and then on the outside. And so first off, when you're looking at a typical long bone, what you're going to notice is that it has a shaft. This shaft is also known as the diaphysis. And then the ends of the bone, we call those the epiphyses. And so depending on which side of the long bone is closer to your midline, the epiphysis that is closer to the midline, we call this the proximal epiphysis. Okay? And then the other end would be the distal epiphysis. And then finally, we have a small region in between the shaft and the end, so the diaphysis and the epiphysis. And we call this region the metaphysis. Okay, so let's talk about the linings of your typical long bone. So around your long bone, we're going to have the epiphyses are typically lined by a layer of hyaline cartilage. And this we call articular cartilage. So hyaline cartilage, we call it articular cartilage. As you can see, articular means articulation, so it forms part of the joint. And it also helps to absorb shock, prevent rubbing of the bones to one another, so decreases friction. Okay, so we have that at the epiphyses. As for the diaphysis, this is lined by what we call the periosteum. And so the periosteum is the lining that surrounds the diaphysis, and it is made up of two layers. We have the outer layer that we call the fibrous layer, and this is typically made up of dense irregular connective tissue, and it's really important because it anchors tendons and ligaments to the bone. Tendons attach muscle to bone, ligaments attach bone to another bone. And so we also have the inner layer, and this layer we call it the osteogenic layer. And this is the layer that is going to contain some bone cells. We'll talk about the different types of bone cells in class. So now let's talk about some structures on the inside of your long bone. So far we've looked at the sections of the long bone, and then we've talked about the different layers surrounding it. But let's talk about the inside. So inside the long bone, we have two types of bone material characterized by its density. And so these two types are what we call spongy bone. And it's called spongy because it looks like a sponge when you look at it under the microscope. It's pretty airy, it's not really compact bone material, and these are typically seen at the epiphyses. Versus the diaphysis, so the middle of the bone, is typically what we call compact bone. And so this type of bone is really compact, very dense, and tight-knit. Inside the bone, really in the center of the diaphysis, we have a cavity. And this cavity we call the medullary cavity. So it's just a space inside the bone, and this space is actually really important because this is what contains your bone marrow. And so we have two types of bone marrow, red bone marrow and yellow bone marrow. The red bone marrow is important because this is where your blood cells are produced. So this is the site of what we call blood production or hematopoiesis. So blood cell production. It's present in the majority of the children's long bones, but then as we become adults, a lot of our long bones then no longer contain this hematopoietic characteristic, and in fact it becomes yellow bone marrow, and this is just fatty tissue. So a way to store some fat. Okay. Now, as adults, you still have some bones that contain red marrow, such as your skull, sternum, ribs, etc., but the majority of your long bones contain yellow bone marrow. And then we have a few more structures that we'll talk about. So lining this medullary cavity, so as you can see, the medullary cavity is the space inside the diaphysis, but lining it, very similar to the periosteum that lines the outside of the bone, we also have another layer that we call the endosteum. And this is going to line the inside of the bone. So it's going to line the medullary cavity. And this is just a layer inside the medullary cavity. And it also contains bone cells. And we'll talk again about bone cells in a different lesson. Finally, before we wrap this lecture up, so I did want to point out a really important structure that you are typically going to see at the ends of the bones. And so I'm going to draw a line at the two ends in the epiphyses. And so this line here in children is what we call the epiphyseal plate. And what it is that it's made up of hyaline cartilage, a type of cartilage that will then become bone. It will ossify later on as the child ages to become an adult. But it's important to be made up of cartilage in children because this is the region that is going to mark the growth of the bone in length. So this is the site in which the long bone grows in length. So they are also known as growth plates. If you've heard of that term, more commonly known as growth plate, but we're referring to it here as the epiphyseal plate, made up of hyaline cartilage, and it's the location of the growth of the bone in length. Now, as the child ages and will no longer grow in length, for example, as an adult, this is then going to ossify into what we call then the epiphyseal line. So in adults, because adult bones can no longer grow in length, now this is because this is no longer hyaline cartilage. Instead, it ossified and it became bone tissue. So now we have the remnant, just kind of looks like a line, and we call it the epiphyseal line. So that is it for long bone anatomy. So we've discussed the external as well as the internal structures in a typical long bone.